Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 25th of May 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm joined in the studio today by Vanessa Beeley. Welcome.
Thanks, Mike.
And also via Skype by Alex Thompson. We will get straight into it because Vanessa, the fire service, or particularly the London fire service, has been on our minds recently. It seems that Theresa May has decided that the fire service needs reform. I'm not quite sure that it was for the reasons that perhaps we think that the fire service needs reform, but she was speaking at Reform, the organisation, yesterday, and she was saying that really, she's done the job on the police and it's now the turn of the fire service. This is what she said: "Over the course of this Parliament, I intend to deliver a programme of reform in the fire and rescue service that is radical and ambitious, and is as radical and ambitious as I've delivered in policing since 2010. So what's she talking about? Introducing a rigorous and independent inspection regime, challenging services to transform the diversity of a firefighter workforce that is currently 96% white and 95% male. So she's going to sort that out. She's going to publish comparative procurement data from every fire and rescue authority in England to see how much they're spending. And she's going to legislate to give police and crime commissioners the ability to take on responsibility for fire and rescue services." So this is further merger and blurring the lines of between the various services. Alex, I know I'm dropping this on you a little bit. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, she's saying she wants to be radical and ambitious. I suppose the safest thing to point out, not being genned up on this particular thing, is that whenever a frontbencher in politics now says they want to be radical and ambitious, they're talking about wrecking. And of course, she's a cabinet colleague of Eric Pickles, who calls himself the unlikely revolutionary, and many others in the front rank of politics now. Although I'm probably by natural inclination right of centre, I wouldn't say that I could ever vote for a Conservative Party candidate now, because they're just cultural Marxists and they seem to be getting away with it simply because they call themselves the Conservative Party.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of wrecking things, one of the other things that they're wrecking systematically is the country, and particularly through the devolution agenda. And here we have a new report from the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution. And they're talking about the impact of devolution on the Union. So this is really a State of the Union document. They're saying that future proposals for devolution should always be published alongside a detailed devolution impact assessment. And really what they're saying here is that the devolution, they're couching it in the type of language which suggests that the Union is threatened kind of by accident, through incompetence or through lack of forethought. In fact, it's probably quite the opposite. So Lord Lang said, "We must stop taking the Union for granted. Since 1999, devolution has been largely demand-led and piecemeal. The committee saw no evidence of strategic thinking about its cumulative impact on the Union as a whole. The government does not seem to recognise the pressures being placed on the United Kingdom by the ad hoc reactive manner in which devolution has taken place and continues to take place. It's now time to focus more on the Union." But Alex, anybody that's watched Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister knows this is exactly how things get done.
Well, yes, a fumble and a fudge, and in the end we have a fait accompli, the phrase I used last week with regard to Islamic State. That is very much how things are done. And if you're watching in England and thinking, well, this devolution isn't going to affect me, think again, because Manchester is already being set up to be the capital of the north of England. And a friend in Lancashire told me that almost every time he goes there, he can see more evidence of it being polished up to be the new really seat of power in the north of England, so that London can wash its hands of everything north of the Humber or the Mersey. And the same is happening down your way, with Exeter being set up to be the capital of a new statelet they're going to call Heart of the Southwest, Devon and Somerset. So no, this is going ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, what do you think? When do you think the penny is going to drop that Westminster, in the not too distant future, will cease to exist as a parliament?
The penny's dropped at MP level a long time ago, because Ken Clarke is on record. It's being tweeted around at the moment. He said it openly: "I look forward to the day when Westminster is no more than a council chamber within Europe." So the elite know it jolly well and have done for a long time. When I was at Cambridge in the mid-90s, the politically minded ones, the hacks among the students, were saying, well, I've got to get to the EU because we're only going to have regional assemblies below that within a few years. So the voting masses, or especially the non-voting masses below them socially, I don't know. I think they might not even wake up to it until the point where they realise that writing to their MP does no good, that they actually have to deal with some regional bureaucrat.
Yes. Okay, let's move on now. You wanted to highlight this. Supreme Court finds in favour of PJS. Tell us a bit about this. So there was a case. This is obviously to do with these injunctions over celebrities and so on. Just give us a bit more on this.
Well, yes, without getting us into trouble legally ourselves, this is a celebrity couple who claimed that the coverage of their threesome would actually cause a problem for their children growing up and being stigmatized by the news that their parents were sexually perverted in various ways. So we've never had a right to privacy in common law, and this is something that continentals like to berate us for, as if it's some supreme virtue. Perhaps Vanessa can talk about what it does in practice when the French have said you have such a right to privacy that you have to basically ask people's permission to put their photos in the paper, or they can sue you. That's the way we're going. So the Supreme Court is going the wrong way. If you see the rare occasions when Lord Neuberger and his simpering sidekick appear before the Lords committees, you can see that they're poor performers. They don't know our law. They don't know our history. And so, of course, they're going to be inclined to think, well, yes, let's invent a greater role for ourselves and do some landmark rulings like the US Supreme Court does, to re-entrench our new position. They've only been there since 2009, the Supreme Court, replacing the law lords. So the trend is towards such a supposed right to privacy. If you're anyone, or you can claim that you have a PR profile, that nobody's going to be able to report anything.
Has the internet made an ass of the law, as the judge suggests?
Well, it has, because anyone watching this in England and Wales, which is the jurisdiction on which the superinjunction has been slapped, can order a Scottish edition or an Irish edition or a US edition of a newspaper and find it there. Or you can find people writing comments, apart from the newspapers which have closed comments for legal purposes, under the articles which don't name the people, and the comments tell you who the people are.
Yeah. Yes, well, staying with celebrity, you wanted to highlight this one. Obviously, probably many people will be unsurprised by this. Certainly Ben Fellows was talking about this problem within the media establishment in the UK and the BBC in particular. But Elijah Wood has absolutely called it in Hollywood. He probably hasn't done his career a lot of good here, but nonetheless, it's good to see somebody making this public.
It is, because the focus on where the elite pederasty is seems to move from one country to another within the English-speaking world. Most recently, the Australians and even the mainstream broadcasters have been talking about an elite pederast network in Australia, thanks to the bravery of some politicians and other campaigners who've talked about it. Then before that, we had the Westminster scandal, but let's not forget the entertainment industry is very much a centre of this. And in that Elijah Wood article, which is an American description of the Sunday Times original, which itself is behind a paywall, if you read the American summary there, you will see that the child actor from the Brat Pack, Corey, I forget his surname, but he was the other Corey besides Corey Haim, from all the 1980s films. That guy ended up killing himself. Well, it's not described that way openly. It's described as he drank himself to death or something. But because of the pressure, he talked openly about having been molested in the 80s and 90s.
Yes. Okay. Moving on. Mortgages. The government has decided that it's a really good idea if homeowners should be able to switch mortgage providers within a 7-day period. So this makes switching really easy. Now, of course, we've seen switching in the energy markets. We've seen switching in other utilities. Now we're seeing mortgages being marketed to people really as a utility more than anything else. So we can switch. Well, we can already switch bank accounts, of course. Now we're going to switch mortgages. Of course, probably the reason that this is really easy to do, Alex, is that mortgages are more and more securitised. So they're sold on already. They're held by third parties in funds in the markets. And therefore, all you're really doing when you switch your mortgage provider is switching the agent which collects the payment on behalf of the exchange-traded fund, for example. So this is all part of the mortgage scam. It's not something which most people understand. And of course, I'll just remind everybody that if you haven't seen the interview that we did, we broadcast on Monday's lunchtime slot with Anthony Carlin, please do have a look at that, because frankly, if you watch that, it's an hour and a half or so. If you watch that interview, you will understand exactly what the situation is with mortgages, how they're sold on, and how banks are misleading people as to what they're receiving in the first place. So, Alex, at what point do we deal with this mortgage situation, and particularly the right of mortgage companies to come and take people's properties when they're in fact not the company that you have a contract with in the first place?
That's many faceted, but I think it has to be an awareness raising issue. Anthony Carlin, who's from Northern Ireland, frankly admits in that fantastic interview that his awareness and training came from the Republic of Ireland, Ben Gilroy and figures around him. And they have battle buses going around Ireland telling people, don't kill yourself, don't accept eviction, read up on the law. And the Irish have always been brave in this regard, and they're starting to storm courtrooms with cameras and insist that sheriffs and judges and anyone else, juries involved, do their jobs properly. It's going to be an awareness raising, because as Anthony Carlin proves, you can arrest a judge for siding with corrupt companies. You can tackle Parliament for permitting money laundering of mortgages through special purpose vehicles. You can go through any of these routes, but until people are actually shamed and frightened, without physical violence, but frightened into doing the right because they fear that more than doing the wrong, nothing's going to change.
Indeed. Now, this morning I had a phone call with someone who was describing a meeting, I'm not going to say too much about it, in which some of the leadership of the the Vote Leave campaign was really pretty much put in their place, shall we say, because they're not really running that campaign in any sensible way. Now, you highlighted this tweet from the Daily Mail saying the Brexit side, if the Brexit side does lose, much of the blame will lie with Boris. And of course, that is correct. That's something that we said right from the very beginning, that Boris was in there in order to undermine the Leave campaign. But it seems there's a broader awareness that that might be the case.
Very much broader, because even if a loudmouth controversialist like Katie Hopkins can spot it, surely Boris Johnson's fellow Etonians and Oxonians in the cabinet can spot it.
Absolutely. And you wanted to highlight this Telegraph article. When it comes to who's going to win the EU referendum, the best people to ask are the bookies. And you wanted me to highlight the fact that Project Fear works.
Yes, anyone not familiar with the 2014 Scottish independence referendum war, really, IndieRef is the main term used for it, and all the claims that were made. The yes side in the referendum for Scottish independence have continued ever since, calling themselves the 45% or whatever. And one of the main points is that we was robbed by Project Fear. Nasty Westminster put the frighteners on us. Well, take that or leave it. People watching the UK column are actually quite evenly split, I think, on the question of Scottish independence in principle. I'm very much against it, of course. But the point is, Project Fear is just a useful shorthand for running a campaign negatively because you don't have anything positive to say. And quite senior figures now, even on the top of the Brexit campaigns, are saying, well, why hasn't Remain got nothing positive to say about the future of the EU? Why have they only been bashing Brexit's figures, or raising the spectre of chaos and pandemonium if the UK comes out? That's been raised by Question Time audiences and got big rounds of applause.
Where is this going to? Which direction is this going to fall? Because I mean, is this fear campaign a bit of sort of what's the word? A bit of clever psychology? Because we've been suggesting that perhaps if the result of the referendum is to leave, well, we know that that's not a legally binding result, and in fact that would start at least 2 years, possibly 10 years of argument and discussion in which all kinds of evils can be done under the radar. Is this a bit of shenanigans going on to try to actually push people towards a Brexit result?
I wouldn't put it past them to be that double dealing, really. The moment the message coming from the centrist continental parties and the system is, dear British, you're very sophisticated, we really appreciate you, please stay, you're the bee's knees. But the snarling side is just under the surface there in figures like Martin Schulze, whom Farage quite rightly described as anti-British to your fingertips once to his face in the chamber in Brussels. So I think that there is this attitude of almost backing us into a corner, so that we take what can be then stereotyped as a little Englander decision and then be derided for it. Yes, I think that would be a very useful way of snarling up any future negotiations, because if we then had a great swing or got cold feet and showed that in the next general election, that could certainly be great ammunition to be used against the negotiators for the extrication of Britain from the EU, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yes, and going back to Guido Fawkes here for a second, we seem to have an intervention here of a little video clip, which has received quite a bit of funding, not from anybody involved with Britain at all.
No, this is my professional environment because I do translations and voiceovers for Continentals trying to sell to the British. And I could recognise not the individual voiceover artist used, but the whole tone of it and the wording in every sentence. I could tell this was written by a Continental, not native in English, but they think they're just as good as us at writing English, and they're not. And it came through in every sentence. Very, very untoward things being said there. And towards the end, they even get the narrator to say, "Vote Remain for Christ's sake." Now, I've put a comment on their YouTube channel. It's a European centrist political foundation that's put this out, saying, "Why are you blaspheming Christ? What's that got to do with this video?" So there's this, what should we say, iron fist in a velvet glove again, buttering up the British and pretending to be admiring of them, and then at the right moment baring your teeth.
Yes. Okay, which leads us into the book spot, Alex, because the book for this week is The Tragedy of the Euro.
Yeah, it's very cheap, especially as a Kindle book. Philip Bagus, Bagus, a Spaniard, I think, or at least his teaching position is in Madrid, and he's writing from an Austrian economics perspective. That's not everyone's cup of tea, including perhaps not yours, Mike. But we'll see what we can talk about there. But the main thing is The Tragedy of the Euro is obviously a strong book title. It's packed with detail on why it is that the Germans and the other Germanic nations have suddenly wanted to rein in the Eurozone and impose this so-called fiscal discipline. It's not for nothing. It's not just empire building from Frankfurt. As Bagus argues, the southern European countries with their irresponsible fiscal attitudes actually did have a big say in how the European Central Bank ran the euro for the first few years. And this really did lead to policies favourable to disaster when they're tied together with much more tightly run economies like Germany, the Netherlands and Austria. So read it for an example of, or more than an example, in-depth information on how the euro is not going to work.
Okay, good. Right, now we move on to Ukraine and the Middle East, and maybe Vanessa will get a chance to say something in a second. But we're going to start off with Mikhail Saakashvili. I have to say, Alex, he's looking like he's putting on quite a bit of weight since he moved to Ukraine.
I've never seen him looking that fat in his Georgian days. Nowhere near that. I mean, he still does his sort of action man stuff, bounding around the city as he used to do in Georgia, doing on-the-spot guidance in the old communist style. This is absolutely unacceptable. You will fix this tomorrow. I'll have your guts for garters. Yeah. So despite all this, street politics, he's piling on the pounds, all right, yes. Yes,
certainly. He must be living it up there. So he's been there for a year, and he's been speaking to The Guardian, and The Guardian saying that when he was appointed a year ago, he constantly mentioned Vladimir Putin. They're saying reforms in post-revolution Ukraine and attempts to reform Russophone Odessa were all part of a grand plan to stick two fingers up to the Kremlin. Well, that hasn't really worked because Saakashvili is now complaining bitterly that progress is not being made. He is absolutely in there as a change agent, and he wants to see massive reforms within the Ukraine. He's saying that the crunch time is now approached to determine whether Poroshenko is part of the problem or part of the solution. and he held a press conference last month, in which he gave Poroshenko a hard time for not fulfilling a single promise made since he took office after the 2014 revolution. He said, for a long time, Poroshenko has been very flexible. If you were a reformer, he spoke reform language. If you were someone old-fashioned, he said, "Okay, we can find a way to deal with you." Now he's brought in a government which has not got any vision of reforms at all. And the article ends up by saying that critics say Saakashvili's recent foray into the national arena is born out of his outsized ambition and a desire one day to become prime minister of the country. Instead of focusing on improving Odessa, they say, he has taken to criticising the government and taking an anti-corruption roadshow around the country. Saakashvili and anti-corruption, this is a bit like Cameron and anti-corruption. It's ridiculous. But anyway, it goes on to say he's expected to set up a political party of his own, though the lack of early elections have stymied this for now. And he ended up by saying, you cannot create something beautiful in this ugly environment, an oasis in the desert. I hope Poroshenko understands the importance that you can't do it a halfway. Half-made reforms mean they get discredited. You get the thing we have always had in the post-Soviet space, where people think reforms are impossible, so then nothing gets done. Is this just pure ambition on his part, do you think, Alex, or is he still being driven by Soros?
Soros is driving him without a shadow of a doubt. I recognise all the things he's saying there, which he said when he was president of Georgia, and I know the original Soros lines to take, which were fed to him. And this is the same stuff. You know, when Soros is directing Saakashvili here to criticise the president and the government that appointed him as a foreigner to govern one of its provinces for them, an economically crucial province through which all the exports go. I mean, that's the height of insubordination and cheek, isn't it? Or, well, on a national scale, that's insurrection, basically. It's more desperation than ambition. Saakashvili does think he was born to greatness, but on the other hand, he can't just go home to Georgia and live a quiet life because there's an arrest warrant out for him in Georgia. Oh,
I didn't know that. Tell us more.
Yes, one of the first things that happened when the Georgian government changed its policy, or the new Georgian government was elected some years ago, is that they actually wanted to appease the Russians to some extent, and the Russians have always wanted to see Saakashvili in front of some international tribunal, rather, for the South Ossetia war. So no, he can't go anywhere else. The only place he could keep his family together before the appointment in Odessa was New York. His wife is Dutch. She comes from just down the road from my wife, actually.
Right, okay, very good. Okay. ISIL. Is this ISIL, ISIS, DAESH? Do we know whichever brand name we want? Well, this is the global coalition, and of course this is mainly a Foreign Office initiative. The coalition has degraded ISIL capacity. Vanessa, ISIL now has lost about 35% of the territory it once controlled. I'm afraid I have to add a little bit to that. So we offer it protection in the areas it now occupies, and that's pretty much what's going on, isn't it?
Well, pretty much, yes. I mean, that's an extraordinary claim from the so-called coalition. I mean, if ISIL has indeed lost 35% of its territory, it's thanks to the Syrian Arab Army and allies, as opposed to the coalition that we know bombed it for over a year with in fact, extreme expansion of ISIS as opposed to diminishment of their power.
Well, if you've got any questions about this, you can ask the Foreign Office yourself straight after this news programme, because at 2 p.m. today, you can have a Twitter Q&A with Sir Simon MacDonald. And the hashtag for that is AskFCO. Well, what kind of questions might we ask?
Please, can we ask our UK Foreign Office precisely why they're funding first responders that are actually Al-Qaeda under the brand name of the White Helmets, which have been thoroughly discredited in various UK column programmes. Please ask the UK Foreign Office why we're funding them with taxpayers' money to the tune of 19 million so far, with further investments promised.
Perhaps we might like to ask them why they were having photo calls with the London Fire Brigade.
Indeed. Why did they send a known operative with extremist connections, as stated by the US State Department, for photo calls with the London Fire Brigade?
Oh, let's see. What else could we ask them? We could ask them. We could ask them about terrorist organisations in Syria, which are not terrorist organisations?
We could ask them about their funding of the Free Syrian Police and the establishment of a shadow military and police state in Syria.
So, there's just a few suggestions there. Let's get tweeting later on.
Yeah.
Okay. This is Alex. This is another fantastic move by the Russians, because we were talking about Sergei Shoigu's comments yesterday on the news program, and this is now Sergei Lavrov continuing the pressure on the United States, because what he's saying here is, I cannot say whether. Sorry, they're talking about the demand really from Russia that the US get involved in a joint operation to deal with ISIS and so on in Syria, and particularly to liberate Raqqa. And Lavrov saying, I cannot say whether reports that such actions have started. So this is the coordination efforts and the efforts of the Kurdish forces to liberate Raqqa. But we're ready for coordination, and I can confirm that they are ready to allow the US to get involved in this operation, but they're really making the point that the US doesn't want to. He said Raqqa is one of the aims of the anti-terrorist coalition, just like Iraq's Mosul. We're confident that these cities could have been liberated more effectively and faster if our military officials would have started coordinating their actions much earlier. So they're absolutely keeping the pressure on the US government, and the US government, I think, don't seem to like it too much.
It's masterful Russian diplomacy there, isn't it? Because as we covered a week or two ago, Lavrov was pointing out that safe zones were being created for al-Nusra Front. As Vanessa said, that's basically Al-Qaeda's franchise in the area, so that the US was insisting to the Russians as a kind of prerequisite for negotiations, don't bomb within that box of coordinates because our friends are there, the cuddly opposition, al-Nusra. And Lavrov said this is a non-starter. And he's let that simmer for a couple of weeks. And now, instead of saying, we're ready to cooperate with you sometime on bombing Raqqa or liberating Raqqa, and instead of sending his guy in New York, Vitaly Churkin, to talk to Samantha Power about it, no, what he said is, let's put a point to this. How about we liberate Raqqa at 6 o'clock on Friday? This is just a an idiomatic way of putting it. It's not really what's going to happen. And of course, the US is going to have to give, to use a dating analogy, is going to have to say, sorry, I'm washing my hair. And if they keep on doing this, 3 or 4 times, then it's going to become painfully obvious to a lot of people, including in the United States, where it matters because they're the voters who can chuck the guys out, that there is no intention of liberating Raqqa.
Yeah. Vanessa, do the Syrians understand what Russia is up to here?
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, Syria is perfectly aware of the ally that they have in Russia. And what we also, when we look at the situation in Raqqa and the US support of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are fundamentally the YPG, the Kurdish forces, to the northeast of Syria. And then you have Russia, if you like, supporting the Afrin Kurds to the northwest of Syria. There's a very clear sort of demarcation, and as you say, very clever diplomatic, political and military juggling and chess playing by Russia. They're always one move ahead of the United States, which is infuriating the United States.
Yes, well, it is. It is.
And good.
Right, now we're going to move on to aid, because it's a related topic, but this was tweeted out earlier by Inspector Gadget. Let me get this right. Britain tops foreign aid spending list with all they've said about how we can't fund our own essential services. So perhaps we can explain why this is the case. Now, this is the article that perhaps was being referred to here. This is Britain's aid budget has risen 144% in a decade. And it says, the Telegraph article saying, Britain is the only major developed economy in the world to significantly increase spending on foreign aid. The UK aid budget risen 144% in a decade. And this is ahead of the G7 meeting in Japan. David Cameron is going to be there, and so they have released a progress report. MPs, Conservative MPs in particular, reacted angrily to this disclosure and said that Britain's spending on foreign aid is now completely unjustifiable. They called on Cameron to reconsider. But of course, what's being highlighted here is the United Nations has a target for all major economies that they should be spending 0.7% of GDP on foreign aid every year. Now, the key point here, Vanessa, is where is this money going to? And it is going to the soft power NGO complex. Mm-hmm. And this is something which you in particular have been focusing on quite a lot in recent months.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've seen that 19 million of this has gone, as we said, to the white helmets. Another 2.5 million has gone into the Free Syrian Police, only looking at Syria at this moment. So this investment is fundamentally going, as we said, into the formation of a shadow state inside Syria as part of the regime change objective and process there.
But this is much broader than just Syria because it's every country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Including our own, for that matter. And of course, one of the aspects of this is that we're looking at almost the weaponization of humanitarianism.
Yeah.
Is that an unfair comment?
Predatory
humanitarianism.
Yeah.
Well, this was the World Humanitarian Summit. It took place on Monday and Tuesday this week. Mm-hmm. And this is the first World Humanitarian Summit.
Yep, it is. And of course, this was generated, I believe it's been UK driven, in fact, going on from your Cameron story, by the Support Syria conference, which was held in February or March of this year. Now, we have to also understand what a huge corporate sector the humanitarian aid sector is. In 2004, it was 3.7 billion. In 2015, it's worth 20 billion. And if we look at this World Humanitarian Summit, I had a very quick look at a Guardian article which supposedly highlighted the 9 most important points, but those were complete red herrings when I looked into it. An important quote from this is from an NGO called Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation. I quote, "We exist to strengthen civil society and citizen action around the world." And guess who backs that?
George Soros.
George Soros, mm-hmm. Open Society. And a quote from them, which I think highlights exactly what this summit was set to achieve. This signals the beginning of the end of the development industrial complex, which involved a few rich countries providing aid through a few big players. Then if we go through the structure of the conference itself and what it achieved, and I've picked out a couple of highlights. First of all is the Grand Bargain Initiative, which is a mutual agreement between donors who will be more flexible and give more directly to local organisations and aid agencies. There will be the setting up of a network of empowered aid response, a global network of local and national NGOs. So we can see where this is heading. It's breaking down of the archaic structure of the larger donors into small, indigenous, nationally based NGOs. That big, the 3 Ps, that's the persistent. It's creating a number of swarming NGOs that are going to be infiltrated into target societies. We then also have the International Education Fund for Children in conflict and disaster situations. And very interesting, they're giving middle-income countries access to grants and low-income loans to finance large-scale refugee hosting. So again, this encouragement of virtual ethnic cleansing from these conflict nations into smaller nations, giving them the grants and subsidies to do so. And then, as I said, currently 2% is allocated to supporting local action. We're going to see a huge increase by 2020 of up to 25% for funding of those local NGOs. And the final point, which is very important, is basically they're calling to institutionalize humanitarian aid. In other words, asking these nations, these conflict or disaster nations, to actually incorporate into their laws and constitution these humanitarian NGOs to, I quote, better respond to disasters and conflicts. So we're seeing a huge push to start creating what we would say these shadow states within a target state, setting up these NGO complexes across, vast areas.
Alex, what's fascinating about this and dangerous about this is that many of these NGOs, of course, operate across borders. And so what we're seeing is really the undermining of nation states. This is a new form of the undermining of nation states, isn't it?
Yes, a lot of people on what you might call the left wing of the alternative media scene are rightly aware of the danger of corporatism, and they'll point to Mussolini's fascism as the modern origin of that, thinking that corporations are richer than most nations now, and a few of them are richer than almost any nation except the USA. But then the NGOs are in another category. They're not private sector. They call themselves the third sector, as if they were greater or better than either public or private service. And their bosses, this is often forgotten, are a small pool of people from my milieu, basically, public school and Oxbridge, particularly a certain kind, who don't really have to work for money. They will indulge in their well, to be very cynical about it, their do-goodery. And they can get themselves appointed to an international NGO which can even have a foreign-looking face. It might look like an Arab movement or an African NGO. I guarantee you, towards the top of it, you will find that the plum jobs and the thinking jobs are done by the same pool of privileged white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, really, to use one way of describing it. So no, it's the same elite.
Perhaps we mentioned David Miliband at that point, just as one example.
Yes, he would object to the Protestant description, I think.
Yeah, perhaps, yes. Right, anyway, so getting back to the World Humanitarian Summit, the UK's main pledge out of this was providing education for children in crisis and improving efficiency in the humanitarian system. So they've committed an extra £30 million of support to help make sure that no child misses out on education in times of crisis. And they have launched the Education Cannot Wait campaign, which aims to help 13.6 million young people caught up in humanitarian emergencies such as conflict, natural disasters, and disease outbreaks. Because, in times of crisis, you must continue to receive your indoctrination and so on. So, of course, this follows on from the last 2 years when the UK launched the No Lost Generation initiative, and that was in collaboration with UNICEF, and that apparently has so far helped 250,000 children get an education in Jordan and Lebanon. So that's good stuff. Justine Greening, here she is. She said this: as a global community, it's time to recognise we need a new approach to preventing and responding to crisis. That's in everyone's interests, most of all those caught up in crisis, and this summit has provided us with a compelling agenda for change. And change, it's all about change, Vanessa.
Yeah. And very quick point here as well, of course, it's completely ignored that the Syrian government has maintained free education throughout 5 years of a US-NATO war of aggression being waged against them. Yeah.
Okay, now look, we're going to have to move quite quickly through this particular one because Egypt, of course, has lost an aircraft. Mm-hmm. We don't know where it's gone. It's supposed to have crashed into the Mediterranean, but we're not quite sure. But perhaps this gives some insight as to why that might have happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, the very interesting point that came up this morning is the fact that the day of the Egypt Air crash, Moscow actually honoured an agreement to loan Egypt $25 billion to build its first nuclear power plant in Dabar, which is to the west of Alexandria. So, it's speculation that it's coincidence that this happened, that the crash happened as Russia was about to allocate money to Egypt to build the nuclear plant, which has actually been in the pipeline for some time, but has not been they've not had the funds to do it.
And this is only the latest in a number of investments. So China obviously has been investing, France has been investing in Egypt, even Saudi has been investing in Egypt. But no sooner does this aircraft crash than we're getting stories about worries about worsening security and how the Americans need to come in and solve the problem.
And how they must lift all embargoes on supplying military aid and weapon aid to Egypt, unsurprisingly.
Alex, do you think Western powers would be so cynical as to use an air disaster to drive this type of agenda?
It doesn't take a great deal of conscious, deliberate cynicism, Mike. I mean, Western powers, and by which I assume you mean the people who sit in government ministries and the NGOs who advise them, are so out of touch with reality now that they don't actually have to have a a consciously evil or twisted agenda. They simply need to read their Twitter feeds and their Guardian columns, and that the view of the world that's presented there will nudge them in the direction of that anyway.
Yes. Okay, let's move on then. Tell us about a new form of Bitcoin. What's it called? Walkcoin or something? Bitwalking?
Well, the currency, so it's called bitwalking as a concept, right? And the currency you earn from it is called walking dollars, which has a symbol as well, W and then the dollar sign. One walking dollar is worth $1, which is 700 kwacha locally, so not to be sniffed at. This is basically, although the article doesn't spell it out, it's presumably it's a geolocation coupled with a pedometer, which is very easy to do in smartphones, of course, and they're being mass produced in China now for the African market. So the poorest country in the world is having its vehicles taken away from it. Yeah. How's that for economic development? Because now Milawians who earn, basically $1 a day are being told, well, you can easily earn $2 if you ditch the bike and, walk several miles to your destination. How much longer it takes you and how much more exhausted you are doesn't really matter, because then that's clocked up a dollar for you, which you can spend in the shops.
Which they probably will spend on the food that they need in order to walk to generate the dollar.
It's wacky stuff. And I noticed that Chinese news agencies have been pumping it out. So, don't let anyone think that the UK column is blindly pro-Russia or China. I can see that there's a lot of cynicism going on there.
Yes. Right. Well, we've been talking about pensions quite a lot over the last number of months. And really, the point about pensions is that we aren't going to get any. And particularly anybody in their mid-40s or younger, I think. So this is now the World Economic Forum recognizing that fact with this report, saying millennials are claiming that, or at least they're recognizing that we expect to keep working until the day we die. This is really a sort of demographics type article. You can look at various statistics about how millennials think that their lives are going to pan out. But certainly the long game is how it's being described, and they're recognizing that they're going to work well into old age. Not really much chance of retiring. I think we understand why. And the other sort of related aspect to this is this report in Bloomberg about how in the United States more and more young adults are living with parents rather than getting a relationship and moving in with their girlfriend, boyfriend, or whatever it is that they're into. So this is a sad reflection on the state of economic reality these days. The situation's not going to get any better in a hurry. But in the meantime, Alex, what's been going on in Paris?
Yeah, the Paris riots here shouldn't be confused with the Calais riots with migrants, which is really getting hairy at the moment and not being reported either. A lot of people are confusing the two in social media. This footage, which a lot of people have seen of Kevin the policeman being attacked and bravely standing up to the guys, is from the Paris riots, and it follows on from what I covered last time about the general strike of transport workers. But if you watch the YouTube videos on Paris riots and make sure that the date is right and that it's that footage of that police car being attacked, what you just saw, there was, it's not an improvised flamethrower as far as I can see. It looks like a professional one. And in the very first second of the clip, another hoodie emerges from left field and with a single well-placed kick stoves in the entire driver's window of that presumably reinforced glass of that police car. So these guys, I do not think are cheesed off bus drivers. I think something else is going on there.
Agent provocateur, perhaps?
Well, not for nothing is it a French term, is it?
Indeed. Okay. And the final main subject of today then is Austria. What's been going on with their elections?
Norbert Hofer was the Freedom Party of Austria FPÖ candidate in the second round, which is in the continental model is a playoff between the two leading candidates from the first round. And the one who won was Alexander von der Bellen, who is basically of Russian Estonian descent. The name is Dutch, but he's not Dutch except by ancestry. And von der Bellen's from the Green Party. And what happened was in the first round, I think you have a graphic for that.
Yes, we can find that. There's the ballot paper first. Yes.
There's the 6 of them, and this is just to give you an impression of how polite the Austrians are. In Austria, you don't vote for Irmgard Gris or Norbert Hofer. You vote for Dr. Irmgard Gris and engineer Norbert Hofer. So it's shows you something about the polarization of Austrian society. They're very much middle of the road people and civil. So those were the first candidates in the first round. And you just showed, yes, there we are. This is the first round broken down by local district. The thicker lines that you can see there are the 9 provinces and within them the individual districts. Hofer of the Freedom Party of Austria, and we're told he's extreme right, yeah, got overwhelming votes, but geographically. But of course, the population is concentrated in Vienna, there in the northeast of the country, which is the green blob of much more internationalist thinking people. And right down in the south of Carinthia, you see a bit of socialism. And then the black, counterintuitively, is actually the mainstream conservative party, as it is in Germany. That's their colour. So that was the first round when there were 6 candidates. And the third most popular candidate, as the bar chart shows, was actually not even a mainstream candidate, but an independent lady. So you can see that the polarization is massive, that the red and black, the equivalent of Labour and Tory, are in 4th and 5th position. Now, that was the first round, but of course, only 2 can go through. And the most popular among the not Freedom Party of Austria candidates was von der Beylen. So it was a straight runoff between those 2. And we're going on to the last graphic there. So here we have the second round. And again, the countryside votes overwhelmingly for Mr. Hofer, who is against unfettered immigration into Austria. And the whole of Vienna, of course, votes against the country. Other areas in the west of the country vote for him. But basically, Hofer appears to be a lot more popular. Now, the final result turned out to be 50-point a fraction for von der Beylen, you know, the stop the Freedom Party candidate, anyone but the Freedom Party, and 49.9 something for Hofer.
Okay. So I mean, where do you see what's going on in this Austria, and what's driving this?
What's driving it is there's been several things coming together. There's been unlimited immigration, migration, I should say, irregular migration through the Balkans via Austria onto Germany. Austria has tried to cap the number of migrants coming in who are allocated and indefinitely to remain at 100,000, which for a small country in population and geographical terms is quite a big whack to take. But as my Austrian friend who kindly filled me in on this said, you know, we welcomed them with open arms in the first month. I think everyone's seen the pictures of that. They are a very hospitable people, but they kept coming and coming and coming. And besides, well, my friend didn't say this, but we know this, and Vanessa will confirm it. They're not poor Syrians coming in, are they? They're from they're everywhere, and they're quite wealthy.
Or in
people.
fact, probably only 20% Syrians, and many Kosovans actually returning. So
yeah, the Austrians realised last autumn they were being abused. Basically, they were being told, "Welcome these poor Syrians," and then they took one look at the guys who were coming in and putting children in swimming pools, and they were neither poor nor Syrian. Krone Zeitung has covered a lot of this, a regional paper in Austria. So that was one factor. More interestingly, behind that, the Freedom Party of Austria, which is not extreme right by any means, it was historically the anti-Catholic party, nothing more than that, or the non-Catholic party, I should say. They swelled in some regions, particularly the southern region of Carinthia, which borders Italy and Slovenia. And in that region, the party, with its charismatic leader who's now died, Jörg Haider, actually ran the province, and they started lending irresponsibly to the Balkans. They set up a bank called Hypo Alpe Adria, which means it's a shorthand for providing mortgages from the Alps to the Adriatic, which, you know, put a lot of ill thought out loans into the Balkans. The mortgages then collapsed, and the whole province of Carinthia went bust. You know, you hear about counties in the United States, in California, for example, going bust. That's actually happened to a region of Austria. You know, so there's been financial collapse on top of it all.
So just as a final point, then, what's the future for Austria here, and is this are we going to see this same kind of scenario spreading out through Europe?
I think we are. I mean, that last map you showed shows that the countryside and the cities are pulling away from each other. Just put that back on screen a moment. The whole country wants Hofer, and the whole capital city, except one ward, doesn't want Hofer. You know, it's 2 countries in one. And then you can go and ask, you know, who are these voters in Vienna? What kind of Austrians or non-Austrians are they? I mean, I'm not disparaging their right to vote for who they want to, but you know, the country's being pulled apart, much as we are, with London voting a completely different way from the rest of Britain now.
Yes.
And on a broader scale, I think the shorthand for all the things that I've seen is that Austria is really hitching loose from Germany, through which it's travelled through the 20th century, and going back to its central, even Eastern European roots. In the 19th century, Austria was the epicenter of an extremely successful and civilizational empire that covered Eastern Europe. And I think that's where the Austrians feel that they're being pulled towards. I talked about irresponsible lending, but they also have a very responsible tradition of helping the Balkans. Raiffeisenbank, which has provided a lot of loans to Eastern Europe, has always had the philosophy of helping people to become independent. So the Austrians, I think, are rediscovering a sense of, we're not just miniature Germany. They've always had this in their blood, really, a refusal to be rolled over like that. And I think they're becoming very cynical about unlimited immigration and about the financial matters that have been untoward in Austria.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Vanessa. Just before we go, how's the petition going?
It's going great. Please can people, you mean the don't give the
Yes.
Nobel Peace Prize to the Syria White Helmets? Yes, please keep signing it because we've now outstripped the original give the Nobel Peace Prize to the White Helmets. And we're kind of roaring towards 1,500 signatories. So please keep signing because it is making a statement. And please go and ask the Foreign Office the questions this afternoon on Twitter.
In 10 minutes' time. Brilliant. Okay, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us, and we will be back at 1 o'clock tomorrow. David Scott joins us tomorrow. Slight change in schedule this week once again. And we hope to see you then at 1 o'clock, ukcolumn.org/live. Bye-bye.